So my name's Cannon, and we're going to go through some stuff related to MVC and some related things to that today. This session is mostly going to describe a code module which I started back in 2015, almost exactly 2 years ago, and worked with it for about 18 months and was happy with the concepts mostly, but not happy with how some of it turned out exactly in real life. And so I did a complete rewrite about 6 months ago. And so what I'm going to show you and actually give, you have the full code to this and a lot more, is what I've done here. And it's been in production use for the last, basically 6 months. So it's fairly well tested, although if you run into a problem, it's not my fault, right? Okay, it might be my fault. So we're going to talk about MVC. I want to go through some of the concepts of MVC and related stuff fairly quickly because I think most people are probably familiar with it, and I'd rather spend more time in the code because there's quite a bit of that to cover. So it goes over MVC, but probably the main emphasis of what I want to focus on today is the idea of being able to declaratively set up a widget on the screen. A widget can be anything as simple as like a date variable, text variable, etc. And then have it auto-bind to the model, which we'll understand more here in a few minutes. The module also does some easy layout of widgets and helps with animations. Like, for example, to shake a window, it's just one command, and the module takes care of all the stuff that needs to happen. So let's get started. This is a picture that I stole from Apple's website. There's thousands of MVC pattern-related pictures that are on the web, and they're all a little bit different, but they have the same basic idea. And the idea is that somewhere you have the idea of a model. In 4D, we kind of have two levels of model, or you can think of it as two levels, because we have the database itself, which really is the model at the end of the day. But generally, when we're talking about it in here, you're talking about it in a UI perspective, perspective. So the model is probably something in memory. Maybe you've loaded some records from the database or something like that. And so you have something in memory, usually. That's the model. The view can be thought of as the window or the screen, or even more specifically, each widget that's on the screen. So again, like a date field or a list box or anything like that. And the idea behind the MVC pattern is to be able to separate the concerns of the view and the model so that, in theory, you can take something from a view, again, a date field, and move it somewhere else onto a whole different window and not have it interconnected with the model itself. So there's a separation of concerns. You can move things around. You can change the model out if you need to at some point. You can change the views out. The model doesn't have to know anything about the view, and the view doesn't have to know anything about the model. And the way that's accomplished is by having this thing in the middle called a controller. And the controller is just some code that basically brokers the information as events happen back and forth between the model and the view. So you can see some arrows in here. For example, in the model, let's say something gets updated in the model, it can notify the controller that that's happened, and the controller can decide based on what was changed in the model if it needs to update one of the views. And then as users interact with the views, it will send the actions, whatever the changes were, to the controller, and the controller can decide if it needs to update the model. And so you have this cycle that goes round and around with the controller sitting in the middle of all of that. So it decouples. We know that that word decouple is a really important one in programming. You're all familiar with that. So we can get everything decoupled. For me, one of the things, as I mentioned before, I really like the idea of being able to declaratively express what a widget is supposed to do on a form and auto-bind it to something in the model, and then just be able to step back and leave it alone. And that's what this module will do. It also allows us to get rid of process variables because of the separation of concern and having the controller take care of all that stuff in the middle. That's about all the time I want to spend on the concept of MVC pattern, unless there's any questions on MVC in particular. Oh, okay, perfect. So I want to just show 2 more slides, and then we'll jump into the code. I've talked a little bit about this, but here's a list of some of the things you'll find in the code that you have today. So using this UI object module, it makes it pretty simple to use the MVC pattern in 4D. I want to just spend just a second on that. When I first started this 2 years ago, I was trying to create the MVC model perfectly in 4D. And I think I basically succeeded. But what I found was that there's a lot of cases where spinning up a controller to do little things, or putting code in a controller to do just little things, really in real life didn't make sense. If you're doing development in the iOS world or with Objective-C or Swift now, you probably hear people talking about how, I just forgot the term, MVC, I forget it. Anyway, people tend to put all kinds of stuff in the controller code that really belongs other places because it's a simple place to do it. And I found that that was happening for me as well. And so the rewrite, which you have now, allows you to use the MVC model completely if you want, but you can also sort of dip into it and use a mix of that and the normal paradigms that we would have in 4D. So if you have a button on a form and all it's going to do is when you click it, it's going to cancel, you don't need to spin that all up into the whole MVC thing. Just put cancel in the form object method and you're done. So it's much more simplified, but you can do MVC if you need to. The module comes with a bunch of pre-existing widgets that are full featured. I'll explain those more as we go along. The binding back and forth, which happens basically automatically. There's a whole bunch of methods that make laying out things on a form if you're not doing it in the form editor, but later on programmatically, that help out with that, including if you're resizing a window, you want to keep a block of things centered, all those sorts of things. Timers, I got tired of dealing with timers on a one-off by one basis. So there's a declarative style of timers, animations, and all of this works really well with subforms. I'll show you an example of that near the end. And there's a bunch of macros and constants and bundled images to make all of this work as well. So I just want to go over a bit of terminology before we dive into the code. Some of this is pretty simple, but just so we're all on the same page, a window is a window. That's one simple. I use the term widget instead of like an object, or there's different variable on the form. We use different terms in the 4D language, but because we have this idea of a C object now, I want to refer to that as an object. So anytime I'm talking about a thing, a piece of UI on a form or in a window, I'm going to refer to it as a widget, and the object or the module does that as well. A block, that's something I use internally quite often, and that's where you can take several widgets and put them together in a block. You can have a widget can be in lots of blocks, etc. You can have a block as big as you want, but it's a lot easier to do things with a block sometimes. Sometimes you have a bunch of code and you want to take a whole bunch of widgets and disable them all instantly, or set them all visible or invisible, or move them around, or you can do it as a block if you've defined a block. The model, I'll describe more of that, but that's basically a C object that lives in window space that's always there. Binding is the idea of taking something that's in the model and having the widget update based on the value of the model, or backwards as well when the UI changes. The controller is just a method, window object. Window object, I started this long before, was it V16R5, I think, when the form command came out. I started this before that, and I haven't had time to go through and update my code to use the form command. So you're going to see I use UI_model, which returns a reference to the window object, which is where everything is. I think I could probably basically replace all of those with form. And you could try it if you're interested in using the code. But it's the same idea, just I had to do it the poor man's way before. And then object, of course, will refer to a C object. So, okay, so let me see if I can set this up for demos, which means I need to get my mirroring. Let's see here. Turn mirroring on. Oh, that is way smaller than I was expecting. Anyone smart? Can I change my... I can't either.
I can't. It's great here.
Okay, anyone know how I...
Just click
Yeah.
scale. Click
scale on the left.
This one?
Yeah, if you click the button that says scale.
Scale a little lower.
Okay.
Right there.
Now change the resolution.
Do 720.
720.
I like blue.
There it goes.
There we go.
Oh, it worked. Okay, thank you. It's amazing what you can't see when you're up here. Okay, and I lost. So if you open up the demo database that came with it, you'll see this little toolbar over here. If you hit dev mode, it'll drop you in. I put everything in folders. Just as an aside, when I was creating this presentation, I didn't have time to pull out all of my foundation code that wasn't needed. So you guys get my whole foundation. So enjoy it if you want it. You're welcome to use it. There's just no tech support that comes with it. But the way I arrange it, I have these folders. I have common, developer, foundation, test methods. That's just for stuff that's in the shell, basically. And then in the application folder is where I'd have all my application-specific code. And in here, I just have a bunch of demos. So we're just going to walk through these demos. And I've got some notes here, so hopefully we can make this work. So in the first demo, we're going to start off. I'm going to show you that I've got almost an empty window. I'll come back to that in a second. An empty method here, which will open the window, and a controller, which is also empty right now. And so we're going to create everything from scratch in this one. So let's start with the method that opens the window. I've got, if you use M, UI obj, then you get a bunch of macros that make some of the stuff a lot faster. And so I'm going to go down and choose the typical open window method, which throws in this code. So every time when I create some code to open up a new method, I just do this, and then I decide what I don't want, and I get rid of what I don't want. In this case, I'm actually going to... Can I make... Yeah, how do I do that? Command Shift plus. Okay, there we go. All right? All right. Remind me if I forget to do that. So in this case, there's a bunch of stuff I don't need, so I'm just going to delete these. I'll come back to these and explain more about those in a minute. The name of this window is going to be Demo 01. And I don't really care about this either. So basically, you can ignore my process init and dinit and this subscribe thing. But basically, we're just opening up a window, and it's this one here. So all very familiar code. So I'm going to close that method. And then let's see which one I'm going to do next. The controller. I also have a macro for that. Typical controller. Did it stay big? Oh, it did. Nice. I thought it only did one method window at a time. Okay. So the controller always has this format. So there's a couple of parameters that can be thrown in. There's an event, and the controller can handle four events. This KUI init, dinit, widget change, and model change. So the init is what you run when you first start the window, and you do whatever initialization needs to happen. We usually call this right from the onload method, and it does whatever. dinit could be run if you had anything to deinitialize when the window's closing. Widget change, anything that happens, anytime a widget on the form changes, it's going to automatically run whatever you have in here. And then if the model changes, this can be called, and you can do whatever you want when the model changes. By default, if the model ever changes, this line of code, UI object bind block for model, just takes any widget that's registered on the screen and updates their values. That'll make more sense in a few minutes. So I want to go to the form for a minute. The form, there's nothing really special about it except that it's inheriting a special form. And every form that you want to use this module with all have to inherit this UI obj master form. And on that form, there are a whole bunch of hidden types of widgets and some variables and other things that allows all of this to happen. For example, one of the things that's on that form is a hidden C object that just sits there, and that's what they would use in the form command for now. The C object is what allows me to do all of these things and to keep track of everything. But all that's hidden, and it's just there for when you need it. So that's all, and I've added a couple of buttons here to start with. So for this one, I want to show, I've got a template form down here. And so I'm going to take a label, and I'm going to drag it on the form, and the string here. And if I show you the method that's inside there, it's just this. $0 gets UI object handle event. And every single widget that's on a form will just have this. That's the only thing in there. You can put more in there if you want, but you have to have at least that so that it can do all the magic. And then if you want to add more on top of that. So everything will just have that one. So let's rename this to something else. We're going to name it, what are we going to name it to? Widget. That's simple. Notice no variable name, just the object name. And so then if we come down back to the controller, oh, I almost forgot one thing. Our form method. Oops, what did I do? I got an extra E in there. Okay, so typical form method. Let's make that a little bit bigger. Looks like this. So we've got our onload, and a few others that aren't really important right now. And I just need to make sure that it calls. First thing it does is just make sure the window's on screen. That's just some logic I always use. And then I'm just going to call the controller right off the bat, and then let the controller handle everything else. So that's all I need in there. So now we get back to the controller. Okay, so I want to set it up so the controller knows about that widget that I just put on there. So again, I'm just going to use the macros, and we're going to treat it as a string. If I go down just that far, is it still readable, or? No. Okay, that makes it a little bit easier for me up here. So each time you do a macro to create a certain kind of widget, and there's a whole bunch of possible widgets, it's going to give you the necessary code and then a bunch of code that's commented out. And for me, I just usually delete a lot of it, but it's a reminder for what options are available. So UI object register widget. I want to register this widget into the system. And the first parameter, I'm telling it what kind of an object it is. In this case, it's a string. KUIW is the constant beginning each of the types. And then I need to tell it what the name of the widget is, which, remember, we named it widget. So we've got that here. And then we need to tell it what we're going to bind to. So what we need to do, I should do this up here. We're going to create part of the model, so we're going to set. Now this is where I'm using that UI object model, and it's going to return a reference to the model for the window, which is just a C object. This is where I think you could just use form in the new versions of 4D. So that gives us a reference. So we're setting text on there. We're just going to call it test, and then hello. So now I've set up my model. There's only one key in there, very simple model. But I'm going to tell this widget that I want it to bind to that test key that's in the model. And we could go through and we could tell it this is a password widget. We could tell it to update on the keystroke, and we could set in the maximum of characters and a whole bunch of things, but we're just going to delete all that because we don't need any of it. So let's run the demo. If I run demo 01, we have hello, not spelled correctly. Did I have, oh yeah, I had that down here. Look at that. Okay, so it's there just like that. So it automatically bound to the interface element. You can see there wasn't really any code there other than kind of the declarative setting things up. And I can change that to something else. I've got a button down here called Copy Model. All I'm doing is copying the model into text. And so I can paste it into VB Edit, and you can see that that's the whole model right now. And it has goodbye in there just as we saw a second ago. Now let's change this. Instead of text, let's set a date. So now we're changing the model so that test is referring to a date. We're just going to set it to the current date. And then we're going to register a different kind of widget. Start with date. Now, very similar, we're registering a widget. It's a date. We're going to put in the name of the widget, which was that widget. And we're going to bind it to test. And we could do some other things here, but we won't do any of that stuff. Notice I haven't touched the form at all. But if I load demo 1 again, now we have a date in there. And it comes with some built-in functionality. So for example, if I hit the plus key, or the minus key, or the W, or Shift W, or M, or Shift M, or Y, I can even do things like just type in the 23rd, and it's going to assume March. Like there's some built-in functionality. You probably all have your date field functionalities built in, but the nice thing at this point was that it's automatically binding. If I copy the model and paste that in, you can see that there's a date in there in the model. But you get all this extra functionality by just simply declaring this thing that's on a form as a date type widget. Let's do one more. Let's just do a number. Oops. Start as 100. Okay, so we have our number. Let me make this a little bit bigger so you can see. So when I register the widget, again, we're saying it's a number. We're going to say it's a widget, and we're binding it to test. And I've got a real up here. I'm going to change that to a long. And I can say that this number is a long or a real right here when I'm declaring it, so it can treat it properly from there. And I can set up a bunch of stuff here, which I'm not going to. I would just delete that. But this I do need to set up. So another thing I'm going to say is for this widget, will I allow negatives? I'm going to say false. Allow 0? Sure. Allow positives? Yep. Allow decimals? No, I don't want that. Allow exponents? No. Rounding will be none. Format string? Well, I could do something there. And then this last one, blank for 0. So if I say true, then any time that the widget becomes 0, it's just going to show a blank. And if there is a number in there, then it'll show the number. If I said false, it would show 0. Let's leave it to true. So those are some of the things we can set up. So now let's go run the demo. And it's set to 100. If we copy the model, you'll see that that's true. You can see the format once I tabbed out of it. It's showing the 100 with a $sign in front like we wanted. If I type in a 0 and hit tab, it goes to blank because we had it that way. If I try and type in a negative, you can't see, but I'm hitting the negative key. It's not allowing me to because that's how we set it up.
Could you do me a favor, Chad? Put the 0 back in.
Yep.
And tab out. And now copy the model and put it in.
You bet.
Okay.
Yep. I don't have time to show you this right now, but you can actually change widgets on the fly. So you can have a widget on the form, and then you can say, okay, it's a date right now. And then later on, oh, no, now it's a string, or now it's whatever. You can just change that on the fly, which is useful in some situations. You can imagine a search field, for example, and if you know they're searching on a date, well, change it to a date. Give them that extra functionality to type the date in. So, okay, that's the first demo, just to kind of get our feet wet. Let's go to the second one. Whoops. So this one, I think, if I remember right, we're going to start off basically the same. Yep, with 3 empty things. Okay. Oh yes. So let me get the window opening code up here. And before, when we ran this code, we deleted most of the code. But what I wanted to show here, and again, in the most recent versions of 4D, this has become even easier. It just wasn't when I first started. But this allows you to create a model before you open the window and send it in, and it becomes the model of the window. And then when you're done with the window, any changes you made are still in the model, and you still have access here. And so you could even, I even have code where I have a model coming from some other process, and it gets sent in, becomes the model of the window, do your things, and when it pulls back out, I can do whatever I need to. So this is the setup code for that. So we've got some local variables we're declaring here, and then we can create a model. In this case, I'm just using the object create. If you're not familiar with I have a C object module, some of you might be familiar with, which I'm using here to work with all of the C objects. And you may have your own. Now that 4D has dot notation, you don't even need it really anymore. You can use 4D's dot notation, but I'm still using it because that's what I was used to. So object set, let's see, do I want to change that? I forget. Okay, we're just going to leave that. The window vars, I'm going to delete. In actuality, we have the idea of a model in the window, and this module also has the idea of a window vars, which is sometimes you have a bunch of stuff you want in your model, but you want to find out, did the model change, didn't it change? And so you don't want to necessarily stuff things in the model that are more just keeping track of what's going on in the window, but not data related. If you want to separate those out, you can. So imagine this like a form 2 that 4D would give you. It's just a second one. We're not going to use that though. All right, so demo 02 is the name. I'll put these in down here and get rid of that. So what's going to happen here is we've created our model here, and when we open up we'll open up the window, and then we call this bit of code right here, init model on load. And we're going to pass it the window reference, which we have, the model, which we have here, and then we're going to pass it what method we want it to run after the window gets up and running, which in our case is the controller. And then I pass true if the method I'm throwing in here is actually a controller in the sense of this module. The reason we have to do that is we have to use a bit of a trick in order to get this model tied in with the window. Essentially what we're doing is we're waiting until the next execution cycle of the window before we get everything attached up. And this method has the magic behind it that allows that to work. Okay, so that should take care of that part of it. This, I want to just do the same thing again. You can actually just create them on the fly, but I like to pull them in because then I know that I have a bunch of stuff set up. By the way, you'll notice that the events, nothing is checked. Part of registering an event, make sure that the events that need to be checked dynamically get set on the page, so you don't have to worry about that sort of thing either. All right, so I've thrown those on there. Let's see. Let's get to our controller. Which really isn't going to do very much. And we could do our form method. In this case, on load, I don't even want to run the controller. This is an important distinction here. Because we're using that bit of magic before, well, kind of while the window's opening, between open window and dialog, we're using that magic. It automatically is going to set things up so that our controller runs on the next execution cycle. So we don't want to call it from the onload method. So I'm actually really not doing anything in the form method here. Just showing you the code that would be there. However, I do need to do the binding, right? So this is just going to be a string, and whoops. Boy, I can't type. You guys are scaring me. All right, was it test? Okay, test was what was in the model. So we bound that correctly. And then we do need to make sure that this is named widget. All right, if that worked properly, you can go to demo 2. We have hello, which is correct. And if I type in good, if we copy the model, paste it in there, you can see the model again, very similar. But importantly, if I go back to, this is the code that opened up the window. Let me just put in a breakpoint there. We've changed it to good now. When I hit done, we should get our debugger. And at this point, that model that we created in the beginning, you can see, oh, maybe you can if you're at the back. Let me get it up here. The model we had in the beginning has good in there. So just to show you, you can create your model at the beginning, throw it in, do your binding, let everything kind of happen automatically, and then when you're finished, you still have the change contents of the model at the end there. So one thing that I do in real code is I'll keep a copy of the model at this level, depending on what's going on. Sometimes I'll do this. Keep a copy of the model here, and then let the window do whatever it does. And then when I get to this point, if OK is 0, which means they hit accept instead of cancel, then I'll just do a compare. And I have a function that compares two objects, two C objects. So I'm just comparing the models. And then I know if they change anything. And if they did, then I can go in and save whatever changes from the model need to go to the database. But if they didn't, then I don't need to. So it's kind of handy. OK. So that shows that. Let me go into the third demo. So in this case, I'll just show you the methods. To get the window open, this is just the very basic. We're not throwing a model in or anything. If I show you the form, you can see I've got some widgets on there. Again, if I was to show you inside the object methods, they're all just the same. They just all have that same thing. There's nothing special about them. Even this post message is the same, so nothing fancy there. And I'll show you the form method. It's just that same one that we're always doing, except I'm calling the controller. So let's look at the controller. This time we're actually going to use the controller to do some things. Let's see, get this a little bit bigger. So controller on form on load on the form on load is going to call this KUI init to begin with. So we're always telling the system what the controller is, and then we're setting up the model. And you can actually use this UI obj model. You can pull it out into its own reference if you want, or you can just leave it in. It doesn't really matter. It's really fast. So in this case, we're setting up three things in our model. We're going to have the idea of a post, which is just going to start off with an empty string, and then a character count and a post count. This is just a really dumb example, but I think it shows off a little bit. And then we're going to register some widgets. So we're going to register the post widget, which is this puppy right here, and then the character count and the post count. We'll register all three widgets. On the post widget, we're setting one of the properties you can set declaratively is that we want it to update on each keystroke. So when it calls back into the controller saying, hey, I've changed, it can happen just when you tab out or on every keystroke. And so in this case, we want to set it to, we're setting it to do it on every keystroke by setting that to true. Numbers, you've seen how those come. And then we're registering the button as well. Not that there's much there, but just so that it's registered. So then anytime anything changes, the controller is going to be called and the widget change functionality will run. And so all I'm doing here is I've got a case statement and I'm checking, is the widget the post widget widget, which was this one up here? And if it is, what I'm doing is I'm setting the character count to the length of whatever's in the post right now. And then I bind that from the model. And if it's a button, we do something else. So let me show you what that means in real life, and then we'll come back to the code so it makes more sense. So if I run this, notice that as I type, the character count field is updating with the number of characters that are in the field. And if I click post message, it clears the message, it sets my character count back to 0, and tells me I have 1 post. And if I do some more and post again, then that changes to 2. So if we come back to the code, again, every time I type something, post widget here is getting called, and I'm setting the character count to that. And then bind from model, all I have to do is give this bind from model method the name of the widget I want to bind. And it has all the magic behind it to know what type of widget is it. You know, was this a checkbox? Was this a string variable, whatever you call these things? You know, was it a whatever, any of those things. And then what kind of a key am I binding to? And it does all the translating back and forth to make sure it can bind in there properly. So, and then it also updates as you're seeing the UI as well. When I hit post button here, what was happening was this part would run. So I've got a comment here. We can pretend we posted, posted the internet or whatever. I'm not doing any of that, of course. And then I'm setting, right on the model itself, I'm setting post back to null, or empty string. I'm setting the character count back to 0. And I'm setting the post count to whatever the post count was before plus 1. So just incrementing it. And then I'm calling the controller. So I'm calling this method itself recursively. And I'm passing in the model change constant. And all that does is it comes down here and calls this line of code, which simply binds anything. So I have this concept called registered widgets. So any widget that was registered becomes part of this block or this group of registered widgets. So all I have to do is say bind this block from the model, and it'll find out which ones have been registered and go through and register update each one of them. And then it just goes back to this object. So hopefully that makes sense. Any questions on that one? Just showing a little more detail. Okay, good. So now, demo 4, I'm trying to just show a little bit more of how it can work at each stage here as we go along. Okay, so let me start off by showing you the window, or the form. In this case, I have a search widget at the top, and this is one of the built-in ones that come with it. You just declaratively set it up, which I'll show you in a second. And it acts like a search widget. It knows how, if it's on Windows, it has certain coloring. If it's on Mac, it has certain coloring, and has a bunch of options. Like you can make it so the magnifying glass is just a magnifying glass, or it can be the magnifying glass with a little disclosure triangle for a menu. A bunch of stuff like that. So that's a built-in widget, and you could extend this with all kinds of widgets like this if you wanted. I've got a list box here, which is going to show a list of tags. I'm actually leaving the list box out of the whole model scenario. There's sometimes you can put it in if you want. I've found most of the time it's easier to leave the list box out and then do things with the model inside. But you can do it either way. Let me just show you what I have inside though. Actually, I'll go back to the search and show you. Again, all I have inside is this regular line of code. However, the list box is a little different. On selection change, I'm calling this on selection code. We'll get to that in just a second. And I just want to show, I only have 2 columns. This first one is a hidden one. I'm using a process variable. You don't have to, but I wanted to be fast. Which is an animal's UUID, so I can know which one is being selected. And then we have the tag column, which is going to show an animal's tag. And the idea here is that every time they select one of the animal's tags, it's going to update all of these fields on the right with the information about that animal. If they change something, it's going to automatically save back in. So the way I designed it is we have a model, and the model only deals with these widgets that are over here. Every one of these widgets, again, is exactly the same, just have that code in there. So what we need to get to, I'll show you the window opening code real quick. Again, nothing fancy here. We're not passing in a model. Let's get to our controller. So in the initialization part, instead of having all the code here, I'm just breaking it out into other methods. So init widgets, let's look at that code. All we're doing is we're initializing or registering each widget. So here's the search widget. That's actually all just one line of code, registers all the functionality in the search. We're registering the tag field, the birth date. And notice that the thing I'm binding it to is this idea of a selected key, which is actually going to be the record for, maybe I just show you here. Where is the, there we go, database structure. So I just have this one table, animal. You got UID, tag, birth date, brand, purpose code, etc. So very simple structure. And what we're going to do is each time they select one, we're going to load the record as it is off disk into the selected key. And so if I go selected.tag, that's referring to the tag field in the selected record. Selected.birthdate. I have a convenience method here, animal brands. I'll just show it to you really quick. All it's doing is it's giving me a list of possible brands for this animal and returning an array. And so I haven't showed you this before, but in this case we're registering a combo box, and the name of it's going to be brand, and it's going to bind to selected.brand. And then I'm setting up some options for that combo box, and all I'm doing is I'm passing in those list of possible labels. So as you know, with the combo box, they can type in something new, but they can also select from pre-existing with type ahead and all that stuff. This allows all that to happen. I do something similar here with radio buttons. I have this idea of a unique combo box, which is just like a combo box, except that it has to be bound to a value. You can't just type in whatever you want. So it's kind of a useful alternative to a pop-up if you don't want them to have to use the mouse in some cases. Checkbox text. I just tried to show a bunch of different types of widgets here. And then I just want to show you at the bottom here, you can see that at the bottom, I'm got this command add block, and then I'm passing in all of the fields widgets into this block. And we're going to do something with this block later on. But remember that the block name is fields block. Okay, so that method just registers all the widgets. Prepare list box. This is very simple. We're just getting all the records in animal, and then we loop through assigning the animal's UUID and tag into the list box. And that's basically it. And then if we look at the on selection code, I'll come back to that in a second. And I have this line of code here. I want to make sure that the search field is where the cursor is when the window first opens, and that just makes sure that happens. So this search field is actually a subform, and so there's some little bit of tricks sometimes you have to do to get the subform to have the right focus and the right field in the subform to have the focus, and it takes care of that sort of thing. So let's open it up. Is this demo 4? Yes, demo 4. So first of all, I'm in the search field here. If I type in like U, it's going to bring up the 2 tags that have a U in it. If I M, I mean, it works as you would expect. And it's got this little clear button and etc. So that's nice. All of these fields are disabled on the side. And if I select something, whatever I select, all gets pulled in there. If I make a change of something, let's change this. We'll add Chuck on the end. And notice if I come back to it, it's still there. In fact, if I close the window, Chuck has now been immortalized. You're welcome. I knew you'd appreciate that. So how's that happening? Okay, here's what's going on. If we look at the on selection code, there's a convenience method for working list boxes. Just returns the first selected row in $sign row there. So if there is a row selected, then what I'm doing is I'm querying the database for that animal based on the UUID in that selected row in the list box. And then I have the method object set record, and which basically takes the current record of whatever field, or sorry, whatever table I pass in at the end there, and throws it in the C object that you have there under the whatever keyword. In this case, it's just the keyword selected. So again, UI object model, that's our window model. Selected is going to become the keyword, and the whole record just gets thrown up in there. It's really fast. Our record's up there. This is, I was thinking during the keynote this morning, this is one way where you can have lots of multiple current records at the same time. And I don't think I have a demo for that, but you can very easily have multiple records and you could do all the same thing with this, just not nearly as nicely as they showed it today. And then I just bind the entire fields block from the model, and I set it all to true, the enabled to true. That's all the code that's necessary. And if there isn't a row selected, then I remove that selected key, so there isn't anything at all. I bind that block, and if there's nothing there, it's going to all bind to just natural blank things. And then I set the enabled to false. So as you can see, that's exactly what's happening. And then the only other thing I need to show you here is on the controller. I won't show you the search field, but if any time the tag changes, then I'm making sure I update over here as well. So remember, we had Chuck in here. If I do something else, it's updating over here. That's what's making that happen. But more importantly, we jump out of the case statement here, and if the widget that was just changed is in our fields block, if that's true, then what we're doing is we're just simply loading the record, and loading the record and using this get record, which sends it back into the record and saving it. So that's how it's saving every time. And it's actually doing it on every field, which maybe isn't as efficient. There's other ways of doing it, but for the purpose of the demo, I thought it would work. Okay, I only have a few minutes left, so I want to run through these next ones pretty quickly. I'll just show you this one first. Demo 5. Notice how it's exactly the same thing, using the same data. All of that stuff's still there. I didn't show you the model. I'll just show you that really quick. That's what it looks like, so you can see the whole record is in there. But everything is working exactly the same. We have all of these widgets, which I also didn't show you before. Checkboxes. Everything's working the same. But let me show you the form. I'm in demo 4. Demo 5. Here's the form. Notice that none of the widgets that were there before are there now. It's completely blank. And so that brings us to the next thing this does. You don't actually have to use the 4D form editor to create all these widgets. You can create them on the fly if you want. And so if I look in our init widgets method, what I've done is, actually the first part is exactly the same. I'm just registering all of these same widgets. And what happens internally is if you register a widget that isn't already on the form, it creates the widget on the fly and just puts it up in the top left-hand corner and already set up to go exactly you want. This is really useful for subforms when you're creating things on the fly, which I use a ton in my real application. Of course, then you have to set things up. And so I've got some extra code here that I've got some extra stuff like set intrinsic size. So it'll take whatever is in that widget and automatically figure out the best size for it based on all the parameters that are in there right now. Just one line of code. So I'm just directly setting up the labels here. And then the layout, there's a bunch of methods. I won't go into in detail here, but they really make it easy to move things around. You can take a whole block of code, automatically line them all up on the right-hand side for your labels, then split them out and do all kinds of neat stuff like that. So basically in code, we're just doing exactly the same thing, and you end up with the same forms I had before. Okay, I only have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to go even faster now with these last, I'll see how many we can get in here. Okay, demo 6, I'm going to show you, this is the same form, we're getting familiar with it, but notice that when I resize the window, the fields stay horizontally centered as you would like them to. You're wondering, you can think of how much code to write for that, right? Keep them centered. It's actually not that much code. When we initialized the widgets, you remember I added a block called labels and fields block, and I added every label and field to that block. And then in the form method on resize, all I'm doing is $center is going to be the object center, which is this convenience method for finding the center of something. And you pass in two things. Well, I want to set in the center of the right side of the list box, which is LB animal, and the window right, which is just the right side of the window. I want to find the center point between those two. So that line of code finds that center point. And then I set the whole set block horizontal center. So I take that whole block, labels and fields block, I'm just telling it, position that whole thing so it stays in the center. And then it just does it. So it was really just 2 lines of code when it was set up. So there's a bunch of layout code that's in the module that lets you do things like that very simply as well. Another thing that can be kind of fun is you can do animations with it really easily. And this is just a really dumb example, but for example, I can hit start animation. And notice it moves some things around, it resized some things. They moved around at different speeds. I can also tell it to shake the window. Let's look at the code really quickly behind there. Let's see, this is demo 7. So start animation, what I'm doing here is that the module has this idea of animations. And so I'm creating an animation. There's a macro for this that you just replace things in the macro too. But I'm starting an animation, I'm giving it a name. And then I'm not giving it a name. That's the name of the widget I want to move. So I start that. I set its final position, which I can do as an offset or actual. I'm setting its final size. These are all optional. And I'm setting the duration for that particular movement. And then I'm adding it to the animation block. And then I'm doing the same thing for the other 2 widgets. And when I'm done, I just call register animation block. And you can actually register several blocks. You can have one block start, and then another one so that it starts when the first one is finished, or after some other thing. You can have code that runs on each execution. You can tell it how many frames per second you want, et cetera, et cetera. But that's all that was, and it did that. You can look at the code. The shake window has a convenience method, because I use that quite a bit. So just 1 line of code is all you have to put in there, and it handles everything, the shaking and all that stuff.
Is that when a user makes a mistake?
That's when a user makes a mistake. It happens all the time.
Usually give electroshock.
Like, that's even better. Okay, let me just show you the last demo, and then we'll be done. Another thing the module does that I wasn't really able to touch on very many of the widgets. There's a lot of neat widgets in there, I think. But a lot of us have trouble creating buttons, and we want to use just stock buttons. I really like SVG for my buttons. So what I've done is I've got just SVG files on disk for whatever I want to use. And I let the module handle figuring out how to make the button look, including disabled states and enabled states and all that stuff. So I'm just going to show you how that works. Here's a couple of different button types, and I'll show you what's in the initialization. There's some convenience macros that make these in just a few keystrokes, and you have the whole thing done. But all I'm doing is I'm registering a widget. Buttons with option is this kind, and giving it a name, and then a file path to the SVG. Same with the remove button, and then that help button is a different kind of button, icon button. And so you saw how it worked the first time. And you can resize. I mean, I could make this one bigger, for example. And if I ran the demo, I think I have to save it first. Yeah. Then it's changed. You can see different things happening. So it's really easy to kind of work with buttons. You can still disable them, enable them, and that sort of thing. So let me just pop back to my slides, because I think that was basically it. If you're interested in this, like I said, all that code's given away. No tech support, sorry. Feel free to use what you want. On the USB drive, though, there was this little cheat sheet. I use this all the time for myself. It's just a summary of the commands and some of the parameters to remind me of what's available and to get it done really quickly. And so you're welcome to use that. And I don't know, do we have time for questions, or we do have a few minutes left? Okay, perfect. Questions. And you have to wait for the mic.
I got a couple. Is it on? Yeah, it's on. First of all, this you keep calling it a module. Is it a component, or what is it, a code base? What is it?
Yeah, I call it a module just because I've not been able to buy into the components very well, like a true component. There's just too many parts about them that just don't work for my style of programming. And so I call it a module to distinguish it from that. It's just plain code. So if you want to use it in your, let's see, let me get back to this. If you want to use it, that particular one is all inside right here.
So you just copy
UI
all those methods?
Yeah, just copy the whole folder.
The whole folder?
If I update it into a new one, what I end up doing with the old structure is I actually delete that folder first. I found that works better. And then from my structure that has the updated code, I copy it in.
Okay.
So there are some dependencies, though, so it's not as simple as just that.
Are the SVG files on?
There's a few SVG, yeah, there's a few ones that are there. There would be inside the, let's see. So if you go in your resources, it'll be inside the common section, widgets, and then there's the SVG files.
Okay, and the last one, the macros.
They're also inside.
Do we just copy them into our macro file, or?
Yep, exactly. It's, where is macros? Yeah, it's this UI obj one right here.
You just copy the file, you don't have to copy it.
Yeah, just copy
You
it.
can just copy the file. Just
Yeah,
add it
into your
the folder.
macros V2 folder.
Yeah, okay, okay. By the way, I just want to say that's impressive.
Thanks, appreciate it. More?
What's your approach in this to record locking?
To record locking, I've gone to, is it called optimistic, where you basically don't lock it except for just that moment. I've moved to that mostly, and like it much better. And so basically one of the reasons I wanted to do this was I wanted to have a system where I could take records, and again, multiple records from the same table in lots of cases is very useful. Whatever, I want to be able to load those all up to into memory and then do stuff with them in UI without programming the widget every single time, and just let it, basically just tell the window, go do your thing. And then when you're done, when they hit save or close the window or whatever mechanism makes sense, I want to be able to say, A, did they make a change very quick without touching database records or anything? And if they did, okay, now I'll take the time to push that back out into records and just lock for just that instant moment it needs to. And find that works, for me, way, way better.
Do you have a lot of users?
Do I have a lot of users?
That's the key, isn't it? You have a lot of users
Hitting this? Yeah. Several hundred. So yeah. No, I haven't yet. Doesn't mean they've tested every part of it, though. So there could very easily be bugs in here still. But the stuff that's hitting all the time is working well. So. Oh, you mean with the optimistic record? Oh, no, that works very well. Yeah, with lots of users. Haven't had any issues. I thought you meant the module in general. So, yeah. No, I like that much better. Yeah.
Just another question on scalability. A lot of code being executed. The demos look impressive. What are the limits in terms of number of fields, number of users, size of database? Have you run into any limits?
Yeah, not really. Like as far as the number of fields you can have on a window, I have some windows that are, I was actually going to show you, oops. One of the products I use, oh, it's all off screen now, I can't show you easily. I guess I can do this. There are some of the redrawing can be a little bit slow. Let me give you an example. In a real life application, this lists animals, and if I want to show a child list, notice how the list animates up. I'm just using those animation type things I was talking about before. Or if I wanted to do something like, here's one, all of these fields are actually, this is in a subform, and those were all drawn on the fly. None of that's pre-built. They were calculated, drawn, set out. And the thing that took the longest there was actually the animation going back and forth. The actual setting the fields up is basically instantaneous. I can show you our biggest action is this one here, and you'll see there's going to be a bit of a lag. there's a bit of a lag during that animation. I haven't been able to get rid of that. But, you can see that there's, oops, if I get the scroll bar, there's a lot of stuff. And that's all completely built from in code. If you looked at the form, it'd be a blank form. So.
One of the things you could do for that is, since you know the height of your window, you could build it, and as they scroll down, you can build the next area. You don't have to build it all at once.
Yeah, but it isn't the building of the fields that's slow. It's that animation coming in from the side. And also, there's a trick with subforms. If you're going to use subforms that are blank, there's some tricky parts about them where you can't always do everything in the same execution cycle. Sometimes you have to wait. And because of this particular way the animation, I'm not showing it here, but it actually animates out, does its stuff, and animates back in. And that takes 3 execution cycles. And that's part of the lag. So, yeah. Are we done now? OK. Thank you.
Thank you.